For that, Craig. Yeah, so this is work that I did as part of an honours year, which is sort of like, it's kind of like the Australian version of masters at the Australian National University with Adele Morrison and Andy Hogg. And so in the context of the sea level seminar series, the component of future sea level rise that the work pertains to is the potential mass contribution of Antarctic land ice, though it also has some relevance to thermospheric sea level, though that's not super the focus. But essentially there's a very large mass of water, about 58 meters of sea level height equivalent that's stored as land ice on Antarctica. Observations indicate that the Antarctic Continental Ice Sheet is losing mass through increased flows through its marine terminating glaciers. And we'd obviously like to be able to project how that mass loss will progress and to understand its sensitivity to human forcing. Now, a big part of this projection problem involves understanding how the ocean drives ice shelf melt at the terminus of glaciers, and particularly understanding what dictates the transport of ocean heat to the ice shelf grounding lines and what sets the properties of waters that come into direct contact with the ice shelves. Since we're interested in future melt as well, we also want to gain an understanding as to how these waters respond to forcings. And the particular forcing change that we looked at in this work is the effect of the meltwater itself. So as we're seeing an increasing flux of meltwater off Antarctica into the coastal oceans around Antarctica, that's going to freshen the waters around Antarctica. And we don't have a great understanding as to how that freshening will then impact the characteristics of these waters that come into contact with the ice shelves. And you can imagine this is of particular interest since addressing some of these questions could reveal thermal feedbacks whereby melting from ice shelves could then accelerate or inhibit future melting of ice shelves. So, let's see what buttons are working. Yeah, there we go. So some studies have attempted to address this question in the past with model perturbation experiments where the meltwater flux off Antarctica is increased and we see how the system responds. Generally, these studies have used coupled climate models with a fairly coarse ocean component. So these models are ranging from 1 to 3 degrees on the ocean grid. And these are just 3 examples. There are actually quite a number that attempt to tackle this problem. And a fairly consistent result that has come out of these sorts of perturbation studies is that freshening of the waters around Antarctica leads to the stratification of near Antarctic waters and the trapping of ocean heat at depth around Antarctica that leads to this subsurface warming signal that's pictured in all of these figures. So this warming signal in particular, it's simulated to occur very close to the Antarctic coastline. And that's led to the interpretation of these signals that they're relevant, I suppose, to further ice shelf melt, that the ice sheet will see this warming and respond to it such that we might have positive thermal feedbacks to ice shelf melt. And this has generally been the conclusion that's been pointed out from some of these types of studies. So one of the, I'm not going to be able to use that. One of the risks, I suppose, of interpreting these sorts of modeling results in this way is that the coarse ocean components of these models do not resolve many of the important processes on the Antarctic continental shelf and at the Antarctic continental shelf margin that modulate the transport of heat between the open ocean and the continental shelf or the ice sheet itself. So just to give a few examples of some of the features or the dynamics that aren't really captured in these sorts of simulations, we've got the Antarctic Slope Front, which is a feature that's quite prominent all along the Antarctic continental shelf margin around most of East Antarctica in particular, where we have the depression of isopycnals that contain warm open ocean circumpolar deep water. These isopycnals are effectively depressed towards bathymetry and lead to create a sort of barrier for heat transport towards the continental shelf and towards the ice sheet. And just because it will be relevant later, I'll point out that this front is geostrophically balanced by the Antarctic Slope Current, which is a westward current that runs along this boundary. So other features of interest that aren't generally resolved is the formation and export of dense shelf waters, which is a precursor to Antarctic bottom water. And these dynamics, resolving these dynamics is not only important for overturning studies and the studies of deep ocean characteristics, but they're important because the export sites of dense shelf waters where these waters overflow into the abyssal ocean are regions of a high level of exchange between shelf waters and open ocean waters. So we might anticipate that these regions will be of import for setting the water mass characteristics of waters on the shelf. And finally, in regions such as in West Antarctica, where quite high levels of melt have been observed, and where the shelf characteristics are actually more similar to the open water characteristics, we're still not resolving the eddy processes that are driving that circumpolar deep water onto the shelf and controlling its rate of access to the ice shelves. So just to highlight what I'm trying to show with this map here, this is some output from one of our higher resolution models, where I'm showing the temperature of waters at 500 meters or at the bathymetry where it's shallower than 500 meters. And one thing that I really want to highlight just with this, or just have in your mind, is that there's just a lot of contrast between the Antarctic continental shelf and the open ocean. So if we're looking at perturbation studies that don't resolve those differences between the shelf and the open ocean, we perhaps shouldn't feel too safe in assuming that the way that the open ocean responds to a perturbation can be directly transferred to an interpretation of the way that the shelf responds, or what the ice shelf sees of the ocean response. And that we should perhaps think about the Antarctic ice sheet as being contained within in a sense, a microcosm of different dynamics that are relevant to the continental shelf, and that these continental shelf dynamics are kind of a buffer zone dictating how much of that open ocean heat is really experienced by the ice sheet. So the question that we then have is, as we're moving into an age of greater computational abilities, if we start to use some of these higher resolution ocean models in similar perturbation studies to what I described before, where we're increasing the meltwater flux of Antarctica, are we going to see the same responses to that freshening that we saw in those coarser resolution models? If we're actually starting to resolve some of these different dynamical regimes that are modulating the heat transport from the open ocean to the shelf. So in order to get at this question, which was sort of our main aim, we had to have an ocean model to work with. So the one that we used is Access OM201, which is an Australian model based on MOM5. So it's a tenth of, this is just some technical details, so this may not be of interest to everyone, but it's a tenth of a degree in the horizontal resolution for both an ocean model, which is coupled to an ice model. And then that system is then forced by a prescribed atmosphere. So we're not looking at the coupled climate response to these perturbations. We're just looking at the ocean and ice in effectively as close to isolation as we can manage. And the atmosphere is provided by the Jere-Gogo-Do product, from which we construct a sort of annual repeating forcing scheme that Carl Stewart goes into a bit more detail in some of his work. But that's essentially trying to keep the atmosphere as constant as possible and just look at the response of the ocean directly to the changes in ice shelf melt that we prescribe. So to give a bit of justification as to why we might want to use this model and what its successes are in this region of the ocean that is quite hard to get right and quite hard to resolve, I'm just going to show you a couple of the key successes of access in the Antarctic region. So one of those is that the model does a really nice job of representing the spatial distribution of these different broad qualitative shelf break dynamical regimes that I described a little bit in that previous slide. So this bar here, I've taken some information from Andy Thompson's et al.'s, where he's used observations to classify different stretches of the Antarctic shelf break into different dynamical regimes that are either dominated by, for example, the action of the Antarctic Slope Front that's retaining circumpolar deep water off the shelf, that it could be characterized more by the overflow of dense shelf waters, or by the absence of an Antarctic slope front and the prevalence of eddy-driven circumpolar deep water transport to the shelf. And you can see that the control simulation in our model does a good job at like capturing each of these, the position of each of these different regimes, which was really nice to see and ended up being a helpful tool in our analysis. And just to point out that within this success, I guess, is one particular thing that I want to point out, is that the model does do a pretty good job at resolving the formation of dense, of abyssal waters from shelf-sourced dense waters, which is fairly uncommon in ocean models. So just to go into that with a little bit more detail, I'll show you some metrics that we looked at to understand the formation of dense shelf water and abyssal waters in this model. Essentially, so first starting with this map on the right, what I'm showing here is in the red coloration, which is on the continental shelf, I'm showing rates of surface water mass transformation into density classes that then downwell in the shelf region. So here are basically highlighting the convective regions of the shelf, and we can see that they're occurring on the parts of the Antarctic continental shelf where we would expect dense shelf water formation to be occurring. And then if we move out into the coloration off the shelf, what I'm showing here is a normalized age tracer, so an ideal age tracer, sorry, normalized by the experiment age in the bottom cell of the ocean model. So effectively looking at how young is the water, or how recently ventilated is the water that's sitting right next to the bathymetry in different parts of the ocean. So the gray coloration in these deep regions over here, for example, is showing you that that water is really old and hasn't been recently ventilated, whereas the green coloration is showing a signal of very recently ventilated waters that you can see flowing off these sections of the shelf that have this convective signal from the surface water mass transformation. And you can see that that recent ventilation signal is getting down into abyssal regions. These arrows are just visual guides, they're not data, but it's just to kind of give you an idea of what we expect from observations as to the directions of Antarctic bottom water flow, and to show that they line up nicely with the age traces. A more quantitative description of how dense shelf water and dense shelf water overflows are captured in this model can be seen in this figure here, where basically what we've done is taken all of the volume transports across the 1,000 meter isobath, which we approximate to be effectively the continental shelf margin. And then these volume transports are integrated along the continental shelf margin and also integrated in density space. So you can get a picture of the net density structure of volume fluxes across this boundary. And you can see that there's a net offshore flow of very dense waters of about 10 sverdrups. That's counteracted by onshore flows of lighter waters, which you can interpret to be split up in between circumpolar deep water style waters and surface waters. So this is all really just to highlight that there are some processes around the Antarctic continental shelf margin that are generally not very well represented in models, and we wanted to ensure that if we're going to try and address that problem, that we're actually dealing with a model that does get some of these processes right, and that we're kind of not just doing the same thing that's been done before, but we're doing these experiments with a model that has very different dynamics controlling Antarctic continental shelf water masses. So next, of course, whilst this model does definitely have a few successes, It's obviously not a perfect model. No model is a perfect model. And some of the key simplifications that are actually very important to our study and the results that we show is that the way that meltwater is input into the model is quite unrealistic. So it's input at the surface of the ocean instead of at depth in an ice shelf cavity, and that there isn't ice shelf cavity structures in this model, just a sort of flat southern boundary. And the other thing that you could point out is that we're at 1/10 of a degree resolution, and that's about 2 to 4 kilometers resolution, depending on which point you're at around the Antarctic continental shelf. And some would argue that you need to go as high resolution as 1 kilometer in order to resolve all of the mesoscale activity in this region. So we definitely could go even higher on the resolution if we wanted. So what did we do with this model? We effectively ran a couple of fairly short idealized meltwater perturbation experiments and focused on the response of the shelf region to the imposed perturbations. The initial meltwater in this model comes from the Jere-Gogo-Do surface forcing product, and it's spatially variable around the shelf, and it has magnitudes that are informed by DePorter et al. 2013. And then what we've done is just amplify that pattern up to a 1.5 times forcing and a 2.8 times forcing. The magnitudes...
Sorry to interrupt you there. I just noticed that Gavin has raised his hand. Oh, he's unraised his hand. Gavin, did you have a question?
It was a very quick question, but I think you're just about to answer it, which is, did you add the water as fresh water, or did you just remove salinity?
Added the water as fresh water, yeah. So it's effectively a river runoff flux within the Jere-Gogo-Do forcing product. So it does have, for example, some contributions to the heat budgets and things like that. So we look at that, but it's fairly small. So we do detail that in some of our heat budget analyses and things like that. But it isn't...
The ocean accepts it as mass?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Cool. So what I just wanted to point out here is that we did use some projections to kind of inform how big we wanted to make our perturbations, but we definitely I'd advise anyone to view these as like scenario kind of projection style experiments. They're definitely very idealized. So each one, it's a step change in the amount of forcing, and then it's run for 10 years parallel to the control. And I've just highlighted here that because it's an ocean sea ice only model, there is salinity restoration processes occurring. So in effect, the magnitude of the perturbation does dampen over time. So that kind of can somewhat limit the length of an experiment like this, how long you can run it whilst it still sort of retains its same meaning. And the other thing I'll point out is that we decided just to concentrate the perturbation to regions of West Antarctica where ice sheet thinning had been observed in recent decades, just to give it a bit of a spatial structure. So what did we find with these simulations? So I'm going to start by looking very broadly at the heat budget of the continental shelf region and how it responded. So if we look at the continental shelf heat budget under control conditions, we can see that it's effectively a very simple numerical valuation of how we tend to think of Antarctica as a region of heat loss for the ocean. So the region gains heat through the advective heat transport across its continental shelf margin, and then it loses heat to the air, to the surface. And so what we would expect to occur based on those previous coarser resolution simulations is that when we add fresh water to this system, we stratify the system and we reduce the surface cooling flux. And indeed, we do see that we do that averaged over both of our perturbation experiments, that there is this reduction in surface cooling flux. But the component that isn't so much captured by the lower resolution models is that we also see a parallel decline in the advective heat transport to the region. That happens to be of a very similar magnitude to the decline in the surface cooling. So this is temporally variable. So I want to bring your attention to this plot on the right-hand side. The solid lines are the continental shelf volume averaged temperature anomaly over the experiment duration, and the orange is the larger perturbation and the blue is the smaller perturbation. And you can see in both situations that in the initial stages of the experiment, the decline in surface cooling dominates the signal, and you see a warming signal averaged over the continental shelf, but that over time, this switches so that eventually the decline in advective heating of the continental shelf region starts to dominate, and you see cooling over the latter sections of both experiments, so that averaged over the whole time period, you get this slight cooling on the continental shelf. So in contrast to this temporally variable signal that we're seeing on the continental shelf, if we take a step out and look at a continental slope region, which here I'm defining as a region between the 1,000 meter and 3,000 meter isobaths, if we look at the waters in that region, they consistently warm over the entire experimental period, primarily due to this decline in the advective heat flux from the open ocean regions to the shelf. Effectively, this region would normally be ventilated. It would normally be cooled by the Antarctic shelf region, but instead, as it's feeling much of the effect of that decline in the surface heat loss, it's being trapped out in that subsurface region on the slope. So when we move away from that simple spatially average picture, everything gets a hell of a lot more complicated. So that's why I like to start with the spatially average picture. So this is just a picture at the end of our experiment, so the averaged over the final year of the depth average temperature anomalies on the continent, well, actually for the whole Southern Ocean region. And just to reference back to that previous slide, this green line here would be that continental slope boundary, and the black line is the continental shelf boundary. So you can see that depending on where you are on the shelf, you can have extreme warming, extreme cooling, and that there are differences in the stages that this signal is at, depending on the magnitude of the forcing as well. But we essentially wanted to dig into this signal and try to understand what mechanisms are controlling this fairly complex view of warming and cooling feedbacks that average out to this fairly small continental shelf average thermal response. So we wanted to understand the driving mechanisms. We approached this by looking at a number of regional heat budgets in regions controlled by different dynamical regimes, so in dense shelf water regimes, in regimes that are more like West Antarctica, and looking at how they responded. We also looked at the response of the shelf break structures, how they responded, how in a qualitative sense, the distribution of different shelf regimes changed as we perturbed the system. And we also looked at how different currents like the Antarctic Slope Current and coastal currents responded, to try and understand what determined the sign and magnitude of the signal in different parts of the Antarctic shelf. So I'm not going to go into all of these, but because it is a bit more digestible, I will take you through some of what we did with the shelf regimes and analyzing how they changed. So this is similar to what I was showing you before in terms of a projection of the of this classification of different stretches of the shelf margin into different dynamical regimes. So this is what we had from the observations from Andy Thompson. This is what we had from our control experiment. And then we've looked at the final year of our two perturbed experiments. And the general trends that we see is that as we freshen, the dense shelf regime diminishes, initially just in some regions under smaller freshwater perturbation, but eventually all around Antarctica under the stronger perturbation. And that we see a rise of this fresh shelf regime. So this is the Antarctic Slope Front dominated regime, which is shown here by the green, and it stretches many of the regions that were, for example, dense shelf water regimes transition to a fresh shelf regime. The other thing to point out is that the freshening that we impose in this model, it ends up being very highly constrained to the continental shelf region and doesn't spread particularly far into the open ocean, which is an interesting effect. So some things that we could tell from this, for example, is that we could look into different regions, such as, for example, in Pritz Bay, we had a switch from a dense shelf water regime to a fresh shelf water regime, and it has a very different thermal response to, for example, the Ross Shelf, where we see a switch from a dense shelf regime to, in fact, some regions having more of a warm shelf regime where there's fairly easy access between circumpolar deep water and the shelf in the absence of a strong slope front. So this sort of helped us understand why some regions that on the face could seem comparable had very different responses. And so this is just a quantification based on what I showed you before in terms of that decline of dense shelf water overflows. Under the control condition, we had this 10 Sverdrup overflow of dense shelf water. And then under the perturbations, we can see that the magnitude of the overflows and also the density of the waters that overflow declines over the course of the experiment, such that under the very strong perturbation scenario, we see a complete loss in the density structure of overflows at the end, at the continental shelf margin. But even in the smaller perturbations or midway through the larger perturbations, even though there is density structure to the overflows, these waters are of a comparable density to circumpolar deep waters and other mid-depth waters of the open ocean. So we wouldn't expect, for example, these waters to be able to cascade down into the abyssal ocean. We would expect them to mix into intermediate depth waters near the shelf break. So basically, using these tools, we identified 3 different mechanisms which we think can be combined in different regions to explain the thermal responses that we see on the shelf. And so the first response is the one that we would have anticipated from the lower resolution simulations. So that's the stratification of waters around Antarctica and subsequent subsurface warming. Now, the addition, I suppose, that we would make to this is that this isn't in our simulations, this isn't a spatially uniform response. We see it's strongly represented in regions where under control conditions there is dense shelf water convection, but where this slows under the perturbation. So for example, dense shelf water convection isn't as strongly affected in these Pritz Bay and Weddell Sea regions under the smaller perturbations, so we don't see that signal so strongly, whereas it does occur in the larger perturbation simulations. But even in between, comparing these different dense shelf water regions to each other, there are some variations in the magnitude of that response, which we relate to the strength and presence of the Antarctic slope fronts. So for example, the Ross Sea region under control conditions in this model, it doesn't have a very strong Antarctic slope front. And so as dense shelf water convection declines, essentially we start off having, this is a bit of a confusing plot, sorry, but we start off having a heat budget that is very much balanced between a strong advective heat flux onto the shelf that is almost entirely lost to the surface through dense shelf water formation and transport. And then as we move into the perturbed scenario, the advective heat transport onto the shelf does slow as the surface cooling flux slows, but it's not proportional. Effectively, the onshore heat transport starts to dominate the surface cooling, and we see a strong warming signal in these regions. So the second region that we see very strong warming signals is off the shelf, and that's what I was showing in those spatially averaged pictures beforehand, is that this region between the continental shelf and this sort of continental slope boundary, we see consistent warming as exchanges across this margin that would generally cool the open ocean in these regions slow. So a lot of that stratification subsurface warming signal ends up being effectively partitioned to the open ocean in this simulation, in this response. And that brings me to the second response, or the second way of second mechanism that we talk about when we're trying to describe this. It sort of came in a bit in the first one, but they're little bit hard to separate. And that's that we see effectively the isolation of shelf waters from open ocean waters associated with the strengthening of the Antarctic slope front and the decline of dense shelf water related exchanges between the shelf and the open ocean. So there's a few ways of looking at this, but I just thought I'd show an example of a transect that, I think that's this one here. So this transect across Idealized, where under control conditions we have dense shelf water formation and the overflow into the deep ocean. But under perturbed scenarios, we can see that not only does the dense shelf water formation slow and then stop, but that we see the depression of isopycnals towards the bathymetry and the establishment of a very strong Antarctic slope front-like structure that's going to inhibit the transport of heat from open ocean circumpolar deep waters onto the shelf. And to so that we don't have to look at a billion cross-slope transects to understand this signal, we can use the Antarctic slope current, which is geostrophically balanced by these frontal features, as a spatial indication of where we see this trend. So in these two maps here, I'm showing upper 500 meter speed anomalies that show us that we're seeing much faster transports along the region of the Antarctic slope current that we expect will be balanced by a stronger lateral gradient in the subsurface associated with the slope front. And these transports are actually magnified quite significantly. So in some places 2 or 3 times the baseline transport of these currents. So not only do we have, so actually, before I go on, I'll highlight again that when I was talking before about the differences between the Ross Sea dense shelf water overflow regions and other dense shelf water overflow regions, one thing I pointed out was that in the Ross Sea, there isn't as strong of an Antarctic slope front character at the shelf margin, whereas regions such as Pritz Bay and Idealized, they transition to a sort of fresh shelf regime or a slope front dominated regime very quickly after the subsidence of dense shelf water convection. So these maps actually prompt me to the third mechanism that we talk about, which is actually not a mechanism that controls the net heat budget of the continental shelf region. The net heat budget of the continental shelf region is effectively determined by a balance between these two mechanisms. The stratification reducing that surface cooling flux that we looked at in the spatially average picture, and the changes in cross-slope transports either at the Antarctic slope front or due to the decline of dense shelf water overflow is then changing that advective heat flux into the region, which is the other main component of that heat budget. And so the balance of those two over time is what's determining the spatially average sign and magnitude of the thermal response on the shelf. But the third mechanism is important though for understanding some of the strangeness of the spatial inhomogeneities of the signal, and that's that we also see an associated. So basically the slope current is accelerating because of the increasing lateral gradients in density, but also we're seeing increasing lateral density gradients closer to the continent, and that's leading to an acceleration of the coastal current as well, which is a westward flowing current that goes all around Antarctica, closer poleward of the continental shelf margin. And the acceleration of this current effectively stirs the Antarctic continental shelf waters, and so it can lead to some very strong effects in terms of the local sign and magnitude of the thermal responses, depending on that region's initial thermal characteristics relative to upstream waters or eastward waters. So the place that we see this most strikingly in our models is in West Antarctica. So under control conditions, if we look at the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula, under control conditions, we see a small flow of warm waters from West Antarctica into the Weddell Sea. But under the perturbed conditions, so for example, by the end of the very strong perturbation experiment, we actually see the direction of this flow switch so that it's now controlled by the Antarctic coastal current. And we see a large westward transport from the Weddell Sea to the West Antarctic continental shelf of cold waters. And you can see the progression through time of that temperature anomaly of those waters starting to impose a negative temperature anomaly on West Antarctic shelf waters. And so just to sort of dig into that a little bit more, what we're seeing here is also a warming signal in the open ocean of the Weddell Gyre as Weddell Sea shelf waters, or dense shelf waters that are formed in this region, which previously would have been exported into the gyre and cooled this region, or cooled this region, are now too buoyant based on the buoyancy perturbations that we've applied to flow down into the open ocean, and they're being redirected into a longshore flow. And so we're seeing the Weddell Sea shelf waters now flow into the West Antarctic shelf, which was definitely not a response we were anticipating, but it was definitely an interesting one to consider. The one thing to think about here is that this response, it essentially relies, it's preconditioned on the fact that dense shelf waters are no longer dense enough to overflow into the open ocean. So there's some fairly extreme precursors or precursor conditions that have to occur before we start to see this alongshore around the peninsular flow. So I wanted to summarize this. Essentially, we did these perturbation experiments with these higher resolution models and expanded the understanding from what we had with coarser resolution models, which was essentially just the stratification side of the picture, and expanded this to recognize the significance of dynamics at the shelf margin to controlling the thermal response of the shelf, and that the slope front will that there will be a balance between changes in stratification and changes in the slope front, and that currents are also likely to change as lateral density gradients are altered by freshening, and that these can change the local sign and magnitude of thermal signals. So some community takeaways more, I guess, about the ideas of how we structure our experiments and how in future we should pursue some of these questions of how Antarctic land ice responds to the ocean. Some things that we found that we think are good kind of learning points is that there were numerous very important remote feedbacks in these simulations that had to do with connections along, like circumpolar connections around the shelf, for example, the most obvious one being in West Antarctica, but we also saw numerous other signals that had a similar grounding just based off the fact that coastal current was accelerating so strongly. So this would suggest to us that if we're really interested in understanding how a particular ice sheet is going to respond to large forcing changes, we should try as much as possible to also resolve some downstream sections of the ice shelf. Another thing that we found was that the location and dynamics of dense shelf water overflows was actually quite central to the responses that we saw. The thermal responses within dense shelf water regions and also proximal to dense shelf water regions seem to be influenced by how that dense shelf water convection changed under the perturbation, and these overflow regions are not generally resolved in ocean models. So this would highlight that should be something that we should be focusing on in the future if we can. And the final thing to note is more just a kind of result, which is that in our simulations, the Ross Sea was particularly sensitive to perturbations, and that could serve as motivation for future regional studies to try and understand why this region, both in our model and in some other simulation studies that have involved perturbations, has warmed so quickly in response to placing a forcing on it. And so I think I'll leave it there for questions. I'm not sure how long I've gone. So we've got plenty of time for questions, actually. So that's good.
Do we have any questions from anyone?
So just a quick one then. Did you look at the steric perturbations and the sea surface height?
Not directly on the sea surface, no, we didn't get to that, but it would be interesting to see, because as I said, well, I suppose that would be one of the elements of this that perhaps would be very well captured more by the coarse resolution models, because the differences that we're showing here are really associated with the partitioning, I suppose, of heat trapped by stratification between the shelf and off the shelf. But whether they're on the shelf or off the shelf, they're still in the ocean. So maybe that's something that you could actually get away with approaching with a coarser resolution model. But no, we didn't get to that in this particular model.
One of the things that you could experiment with, I guess, is putting in the freshwater at a wider range of depths, right? I mean, we know that the water is coming off the shelves, perhaps 400, 700 meters sometimes, right? Yeah. So is that something you've looked at?
No, not me personally. So I'm no longer at the place where we work with this model, but more broadly, there definitely is a lot of interest in how can we realistically input meltwater into ocean models. Can we resolve cavity shapes? Some work at GFDL has been done on that, and in various other modeling centers. I think it's not quite at the stage that we're doing perturbation studies with models like that, but I think we'll be there soon. Whether or not it's me personally, I'm not sure. I'm about to start my PhD, so we'll see. But yeah, the shape of ice, including the shape of ice shelf cavities and including input levels at depth, I think will be important, both for the nature of the response. For example, the fact that we're putting in our meltwater all at the surface, you would imagine that that's going to exaggerate the stratification response that we see in all of these models, which is why I would be careful about extrapolating these too much to timelines or anything like that, because it's going to be the fact that we're putting in everything at the surface is likely going to exacerbate those responses and make them quicker as well. So trying to compare with inputs at depth, I think is going to be important.
And what's the spatial pattern of where you're putting the fresh water?
Yeah. So it's essentially the extra fresh water. We've amplified all the West Antarctic ice shelves, the Ross, and I think there's a couple in here. It's all the ice shelves that had been observed to thin in the Paolo 2015 study was what we used as a guide. Though you can definitely justify many other patterns. We weren't particularly focused on having like the perfect predictive pattern, since in a sense, this work shows that some of those predictions won't be including these feedbacks. So it can be a little bit tricky to pick a projection of where the
there was no inclusion of where icebergs are melting or anything like that.
In this one, no, there's no inclusion of icebergs. Yes, but that is also something that the capabilities have increased a lot recently, and that's definitely doable now and should be done. Because that also might affect, for example, we were showing that a lot of the freshening signal was quite closely constrained to the shelf, and the inclusion of icebergs might affect that, though it might also be the case that features such as the Antarctic Slope Current constrain many of the icebergs to the shelf anyway. Yet to be seen, I suppose.
Do we have any other questions? Sorry, I thought that was somebody about to ask a question. So I think this work is really cool, and it really highlights the importance of small-scale features. I should know the answer to this question, but do you know anyone who's doing fully coupled higher resolution experiments like this? And are you continuing this kind of work in your PhD?
Yeah, no, I guess I'm not sure about that. I love this stuff. I'm very interested in the slope front, and I do imagine continuing looking at the slope front, whether it will be also ice related as well. Less sure. I guess there's a long time to figure all of that out. But in terms of higher resolution, I know that not to the degree of 1/10 of a degree, but definitely quarter degree experiments are being done. And Joelle and Russell's has done some experiments. I imagine that stuff's almost ready, where they followed on from, they had a paper in 2018, which was all 1 degree. Actually, I think I've got a figure from it in here, but they had a 1 degree simulation study, Ronsley et al. 2018, and I think they're following up on that with a quarter degree version of a similar perturbation study, and that's in a coupled climate model. But I don't know of anything to the scale of 1/10 of a degree. The Goddard 2017 paper, it's not a freshwater forcing perturbation study, but it does, the perturbations that they apply do include some freshwater, in the sense that precipitation changes and things like that. And that was at 1/10 of a degree. And that showed a lot of some of the same responses that we found here in terms of the changing dynamics of the slope front with regards to freshening, but the freshening signal was of a different nature, and they still saw these sensitivities. They also saw the sensitivity of the Ross Shelf region, like how quickly the temperatures on the Ross Shelf changed in response to perturbation in that study. Yeah, but not too sure about other very high resolution.
We have another question here from Peter. He says, you may have discussed this, but is it possible to estimate the surface radiative balance that would drive the 1.5 times or 2.8 times melt?
At this stage, I would say I would be skeptical, just because here we're really trying to understand feedbacks that could accelerate. So in a sense, that answer is going to be very dependent on what feedbacks end up being true. And we don't really yet know the details of how all of the feedbacks function. So it's kind of tricky to say. But so the 1.5, and I did base it off an RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5 projection by Nick Gollidge at 2100. So basically that magnitude was what they saw in their land ice models at 2100, but their model was forced by this ocean response. So it has an accelerating positive feedback that like already in it essentially. So it's a little bit difficult to detangle these things. But that might be a good starting place, is that it could be associated with a 100 years from now, 4.5 and 8.5, but I would be careful, I guess, about thinking of that too strongly.
All right, one more question then. So 1/10 of a degree is an interesting number, because then that's eddy resolving, pretty much everywhere, right? And then you talked about some new stuff at GFDL, where using 1/4 of a degree. Well, that's not, right? That's kind of like right in the middle of where you don't know what you're supposed to be doing with respect to eddy related stuff. Yeah. Now, in Antarctica, it might be, no, if it's a lat long grid, then you're doing a slightly better job in Antarctica, right? So is 0.25 sufficient in Antarctica, but not sufficient elsewhere? Or do you think
not only is the latitude grid dependent on latitude, but the spatial scales that you need to resolve are dependent on latitude. So the Rossby radius is dependent on latitude as well. So the fact that the grids are smaller by Antarctica doesn't get you out of the problem, unfortunately. And because of the various issues associated with the bathymetry in these regions, there have been studies that have suggested that you need to go as high as 1 kilometer resolution to get all the eddies in this region, which
Yeah, no, but the issue is not all the
realistic
issue
at the moment,
is
not for perturbation studies at least, maybe for understanding baseline dynamics. So we just need to be wary of what possible effects there could be if some of the mesoscale eddies were under-resolved. So for example, in this study, one possibility could be that when we're talking about the strengthening of the slope front, in a fully eddy resolving situation, it's possible that some of that strengthening would be counteracted by an increase of mesoscale eddy activity.
okay.
So we might not see that response as strongly. But we also wouldn't see the positive, so necessarily see the stratification feedback as strongly, you know, if we had meltwater input at depth. So it's kind of like, it could be in this situation that both the strength of our warming feedback and the strength of our cooling feedback could both be a bit too strong. So there's definitely details to dig in there as to the relative magnitudes of these effects and how they are affected by resolution. Yeah, there's just a lot to know, but it's a difficult area to model. And especially, I think, as we've sort of shown with this study, having the full circumantarctic perspective changes the picture. So you can get really, really high resolutions if you model a really small region, but you might be missing some remote feedbacks in that case. So it's just going to take a lot of studies that are coming from different angles and combining those to see where we get until we can maybe get to the point where we're doing circumantarctic perturbations with 1 degree, 1 kilometer models. But you know, you always want higher resolution, I suppose. But with your questions on the 1/4 degree, I would, my gut feel would be that you would see that the slope front strengthening signal even stronger. So for example, I know Kate Snow did a meltwater perturbation study back in 2016, I think. That was just a region of the shelf, and it was at a 1/4 degree resolution as well. And she found, and that was, I think the region was from the Weddell over, like it was like an Atlantic sector region, I think. And she actually found cooling on the shelf quite substantially because of this slope front effect. That was like strongly dominant, whereas here there was much more of a balance between those two, and different elements were dominant at different times. Yeah, so I'm interested, for example, I know, as I said, I think Joellen Russell's doing some work at a 1/4 degree, so I'll be interested to see what comes out of that as to where it fits on this sliding scale of ASF dominated and stratification dominated.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. That really was quite a good talk. I enjoyed that a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Cool. Never know how these things end.
Do we have any more questions? Any final questions? Silence. Sometimes there's someone who just like is stumbling to work out how to turn their mic on. Okie doke. Well, thanks again, Ruth. It was a really neat talk, and I hope everyone has a good day.
Cool. Thanks for calling in, everyone. Maybe I'll meet you in person one day.
Yeah. Good luck with your PhD.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm not sure how to read.